Deer carcasses lay scattered across the island, several at once, and all laid out in different spots. But what made it unsettling wasn't just the carcasses. They were arranged too deliberately. Each one had its own precise location, and whenever one was picked clean, another would appear there before long. It was as though someone was making sure there was always fresh carrion on the island. The smell quickly drew in the usual scavengers, bald eagles, ravens, and other carrion feeders. They circled overhead, landed beside the carcasses, tore at the flesh, then took off again. But apart from them, there was almost no one there. And yet, this island had once been completely different. Seabirds used to nest here, their cries filling the air. Ancient murrelets and other seabirds once made their home on its shores. That idyllic scene was gone now. All that remained were the carcasses of reindeer. This island is part of Haida-Gwaii, an archipelago off Canada's northern Pacific coast. The mainland is only about 50 miles away, not exactly the end of the world, but still far enough for the island's wildlife to follow its own rules. And this place has never been ordinary. Haida-Gwaii is home to more unique endemic subspecies than any other area of comparable size in Canada. In other words, it's an isolated island ecosystem where many plants and animals evolved on their own. As for the carcasses, they belong to Sitka black-tailed deer. These deer are native to the surrounding region. They live on the mainland in the coastal forests of northern British Columbia, and they're also found on Haida-Gwaii. But that still doesn't explain who had arranged them there, or why. The first theory was nature. I mean, it seemed simple enough. A deer died, something found it, and then the birds arrived. Nothing supernatural about that. For example, maybe a predator had killed the deer. Except that theory fell apart almost immediately. Many of the smaller islands in Haida-Gwaii simply don't have any large land predators, and even if you imagined that one somehow swam all the way out there, it still wouldn't explain why dozens of identical carcasses kept turning up in the exact same places. It's a predator, not a serial killer. And more importantly, there would have been marks on the bodies, bite wounds, scratches, the usual signs of a predator attack. There was nothing like that. The carcasses had only been torn apart by birds of prey, and before that, no animal had touched them at all. So then there was a second theory. Maybe the deer had drowned. They could have gone into the water, tried to swim between the islands, been overwhelmed by the current, and eventually washed ashore. That kind of thing does happen. But then again, there is no mistaking a drowned animal for anything else. It's bloated and just gross. Besides, these deer couldn't have been drowning over and over again only to wash up in the exact same spots every time. That left one more possibility: disease. Maybe an infection had spread through the deer population, or some parasite was killing them off in large numbers. On the surface, it sounded plausible. If dead deer kept appearing on the island again and again, it really did look like some kind of outbreak. But that theory still couldn't explain the most important part. Why did the bodies end up not randomly all over the island, but in the same places? Why would one carcass disappear only for another one to appear in its place? Diseases can be strange, sure, but they don't usually arrange deer carcasses neatly around an island. There was one final detail, and once it came to light, every natural explanation started falling apart. The carcasses had bullet holes in them. And just like that, it was obvious this wasn't some freak accident. Bullet holes don't simply appear because Mother Nature suddenly decided to take up firearms. So yeah, it had to be a person. At that point, we were no longer dealing with animals that had simply died. These deer had been killed. And someone had been carrying their carcasses out and placing them in specific locations again and again. Before long, investigators discovered that the deer hadn't been placed there randomly. They'd been laid out across the island to eradicate rats. It's like someone got the animals mixed up. Because when you need to get rid of rats, the first thing that comes to mind are traps, poison, bait, something small, practical, and effective. Definitely not the carcasses of large deer scattered around an island. And besides, if the deer were supposed to be rat bait, where were the rats? Around the carcasses, there were bald eagles, ravens, and other scavenging birds, but no rats, not a single one. At first glance, the whole thing looked like a complete failure. People set out to fight rats, and instead they opened up an all-you-can-eat buffet for birds of prey. I mean, the eagles probably weren't complaining, or had the deer been poisoned? In that case, any birds that fed on the meat would have been in mortal danger. People should have been doing everything they could to keep them away from the bait, but no one was. In fact, it was the opposite. People were watching the results and seemed pleased with them. The scavengers were showing up exactly where they were supposed to. The carcasses disappeared, then new ones were placed in the same spots, and the cycle started all over again. The whole thing looked like some unbelievably elaborate plan that made absolutely no sense. But before we could make sense of that plan, we first had to understand why people on this island hated the rats so much. And it turned out the rats weren't just an annoyance, they'd been having a devastating impact on the island's wildlife for years. Like I said earlier, these islands used to feel completely different. Seabirds nested there, and above the high tide line, the ground was teeming with life. Calls, burrows, chicks, adult birds returning to their nests, but then the rats arrived. From there, things followed the all-too-familiar pattern of an invasive species taking over new territory. The rats ate the eggs, they ate the chicks. Sometimes they even attacked adult birds if they caught them sitting in their nests. On the mainland, the birds might have still stood some chance. The ecosystem is more complex, there are more predators to keep rats in check, and there's simply more room. But on a tiny island, it's a completely different story. If birds have been nesting somewhere for centuries without rats around, they're simply not equipped to deal with a neighbor like that. To be fair, nobody's prepared for a neighbor who's gonna try to bite a chunk out of you. The outcome was pretty predictable. On the islands where rats appeared, 27 breeding populations of 7 seabird species vanished or were wiped out entirely. Rats were found on at least 20 islands across Haiti, and scientists blame them for pretty much all of the birds' problems. Arechica Island was hit especially hard. Historically, hundreds of pairs of seabirds nested there, ancient merlets, Cassin's auklets, and fork-tailed storm petrels, around 500 pairs of each species. But when researchers surveyed the island in the 1980s, they couldn't find a single active seabird burrow. A place that had once been a thriving seabird colony was gradually left with almost nothing. And this, by the way, is what happened to the eggs. No wonder the birds got the hell out of there. So yeah, something had to be done about all this. People were especially worried about the ancient merlets. They're small seabirds, not exactly the most impressive-looking creatures, and honestly, they always look a little rumpled. But they're incredibly important to the archipelago. Roughly half of the world's ancient merlet population nests right here. And their numbers were falling so quickly that in Canada, the species was already considered at risk. So action had to be taken, and fast. But how did rats end up on the islands in the first place? They obviously didn't swim all the way there as one big happy group. It all started with people and their ships. In 1774, Spanish explorer Ferdinand Juan Perez became the first European to encounter the Haida, the indigenous people of the archipelago. After that, trade began to pick up. More and more ships arrived at the islands, carrying goods, furs, and supplies, along with something absolutely no one had ordered: rats. They could have brought smallpox or typhus instead. Although, wait, yeah, they brought smallpox too, just a little later. Classic. The rats simply scurried off the ships and onto the islands where they stayed. That's usually how it happens. One ship, then another, and before long the island has a brand new problem living on it, and so the invasion dragged on for nearly 3 centuries. The main problem was that the island birds were completely unprepared for rats. They'd evolved in a world where predators like that simply didn't exist. So the local birds had never developed any real defenses. They couldn't recognize danger by smell, they didn't immediately fly away, and they didn't even know how to fight back. To them, a rat wasn't an enemy they needed to fear. It was just some strange new thing that had suddenly appeared nearby. Maybe even an amusing one, scurrying around, nosing through things. For a rat, though, this was the perfect situation. Many seabirds nest right on the ground or in burrows. Ancient merlets, for example, dig their burrows in the forest floor, often among native conifer trees. For the bird, it's a great hiding place. For a rat, it's a ready-made tunnel leading straight to food. So the rats could simply crawl inside, right up to the eggs or even the chicks, while the adult birds had no idea what to do. They were used to sitting tight and waiting for danger to pass. So that's exactly what they did, which obviously didn't help at all. Out at sea, the ancient merlet's perfectly at home. It flies, dives, and hunts for food far below the surface. But on land, it's a completely different bird, slow, awkward, and badly equipped to deal with attacks from mammals. So the rats didn't need to be some kind of super predators. All they had to do was reach an island where nothing knew what they were. But let's get back to the deer, because this is where the scale of the whole operation really becomes clear. This wasn't some one-off experiment where people showed up, laid out some bait, and waited to see what would happen. No, the rat eradication effort on Haiti became a major full-scale program. It was launched all the way back in 2010, because by then the problem had become impossible to ignore. The rats had already pushed the island's native wildlife to the brink. The most obvious victims were the seabirds. Get rid of the rats and the birds might finally have a chance to nest in peace again, raise their chicks, and return to the colonies they once called home. But it wasn't just about the birds. The rats were affecting literally everything, from plants to local shrews and other small animals, so the goal wasn't simply to kill the rats, it was to restore the natural balance of the islands, remove what was destroying them, and give everything else a chance to recover. But the moment people realized they had to do something about the rats, they ran into a problem. How exactly were they supposed to do it? The animals were small, elusive, and spread across an area of more than 3,800 square miles. The first idea was the simplest: put out poison. The rats would eat it, and the problem would solve itself. Except that only worked on paper, not in the real world, because the rats weren't the only animals living there. There were other species nearby too, species nobody wanted to kill. Take the native shrews, for example. They were small and looked a little like rats, but they weren't causing any harm. And here's the thing, they'd been living there for so long that wiping out the shrews along with the rats would have been a pretty strange way to save nature. So the plan was split into several stages. First came the preparation, figuring out where to place the bait, how to protect the other animals, and how to confirm afterward that the rats were really gone. Then came the eradication itself. And after that, a long period of monitoring, because just one surviving rat could restart the whole problem. But we'll come back to that a little later. Just keep that thought in mind. Working on the islands was brutal. Every day, the field team started at around 7 in the morning. By 8, each island already had 1 or 2 biologists on it, and then the rounds began. Except rounds makes it sound much calmer than it really was. In fact, they had to push their way through thick vegetation, across damp, wild, uneven terrain. The bait stations were connected by little more than rough footpaths. Lose focus for just a second, and you'd end up on the ground with a few new bruises. And they did this for 40 days straight. At this point, I'd probably ask, guys, wouldn't mousetraps be easier? But actually, those would have been even worse. The island was large, the terrain was difficult, there were a lot of rats, and the entire area had to be covered at once. A trap kills 1 rat, and then it has to be checked and reset. A single bait station, on the other hand, could deal with several rats. On Arechica Island, bait stations became the main weapon in the fight. Inside each one was poison bait containing an anticoagulant, which stopped the rats' blood from clotting properly. The animals would eventually die from internal bleeding. But these stations weren't just open bowls of poison. They had lids, dividers, and narrow entrances designed to let rats reach the bait while keeping other animals out as much as possible. The stations were also secured to the ground with rebar stakes and cable ties so they couldn't be dragged away. The bait blocks were made large enough that small birds, even if they somehow got to them, couldn't simply pick them up and fly off. To make sure the rats were interested, the bait was flavored with anchovy oil. For a rat, that's basically a gourmet meal. Strong-smelling, oily, and extremely hard to resist. Even the color was deliberate. The bait blocks were dyed green because seed-eating birds generally find that color less appealing. The stations were placed roughly every 160 feet, ensuring there was bait within every possible rat territory. This is what the network looked like on the map of one of the islands. After that, the stations had to be checked constantly, refilled, and monitored to record how much poison disappeared each day. Every data point was logged with GPS coordinates so the team could see where rats were still alive and where things had finally gone quiet. But as I said, the work didn't end once the poisoning campaign was over. They still had to prove that there were no rats left. To do that, some of the animals had been fitted with radio collars in advance and tracked using telemetry. By the end of the operation, every one of those tagged rats was dead. And the bait stations kept being checked long after that. In fact, monitoring continued for 2 years. Because in a lot of programs like this, it's not enough to kill a lot of rats. You have to make absolutely sure you got every single one. Not one left behind. That's how programs like this work. There's no room for half measures. If even 2 rats are left on the island, the whole thing becomes a colossal waste of time, money, and effort. Within a couple of years, the rats will have multiplied again as if no one had ever touched them. That's exactly what happened on Henderson Island in the South Pacific. In 2011, after years of preparation, helicopters dropped 80 tons of poisoned grain pellets across the island. The project cost $2 million, and at first, everything seemed to be going well. The rat population plummeted, leaving only around 60 to 80 individuals on the island. and I'm sure every last one of them was crackling nastily, because just a few years later, the rat population had climbed right back up to 50,000 to 100,000, almost exactly where it had been before the poisoning campaign. That's because rats breed incredibly fast. A female can give birth to several pups every couple of months, and the young females quickly become old enough to reproduce themselves. So basically, 0 rats means success. 2 rats, and the whole thing starts all over again. By the way, how did the scientists figure out how much bait they needed to make sure it worked on every single rat? After all, no one knew exactly how many rats there were. Use too little and some of the rats simply wouldn't get to it. They'd survive, and a few years later the whole operation would have to be repeated. Use too much and the risk to other animals would go up. They needed to get the amount exactly right, so the researchers came up with a pretty weird test. They made the rats glow. Hit the button if you also thought of the glowing rabbit from Sherlock. On 3 small islands, they spread not actual poison, but a safe test bait. It contained pyranine, a substance that makes rat urine and feces glow bright green under ultraviolet light. They tested different amounts of bait, ranging from roughly 24 to 66 pounds every 2.5 acres. Then they trapped rats and checked whether each one had eaten the bait. If the rats' most private areas were glowing green, that meant they'd found and eaten it. An extremely awkward inspection, but an honest one. That's how the team figured out the crucial thing, the amount of bait needed for virtually every rat to find it, and that was exactly what they needed to know. But once the poisoning was over, a new problem emerged. The rats had eaten the bait, become sick, and died, and now their bodies could be lying anywhere on the island. And that put more than just the rats at risk. A crow could eat a poisoned rat and die from the toxin too. Then an eagle could eat that crow, allowing the poison to move further up the food chain and kill animals that were never meant to be targeted in the first place. In 1995, after a similar operation on Langara Island, roughly half of the local ravens died. No one knows for sure whether they ate the bait directly or fed on poisoned rats, but no one wanted a repeat of that disaster. So after the bait was dropped, teams began combing the islands for rat carcasses. Altogether, they covered 148 miles and spent 141 hours searching and found just 2 dead rats. That doesn't mean only 2 rats died. It means the rest were nearly impossible to find. The rats may have died in burrows, beneath rocks, or deep and thick vegetation. Some carcasses were quickly eaten by scavengers. Others simply vanished into the island before any human could reach them. And that's when I finally understood why there were deer carcasses on the island. Still not clear? Let me explain. People were poisoning the rats, but there was no way they could collect every last body, which meant poisoned rats could be lying all over the island, ready to be eaten by scavengers at any moment. Ravens, crows, bald eagles. And you can't just scare the birds away. This is a wild island. Birds fly wherever they please. And to them, the smell of a dead rat is basically a dinner invitation. So the people behind the operation came up with a slightly insane solution. Offer the scavengers a different meal instead. From August 17th to September 16th, 2011, deer were shot and their carcasses were placed in 2 designated areas near Arechica Island. Not randomly, but in carefully chosen locations, away from the zones where the rat eradication was taking place and where people hoped seabirds would eventually return. And it worked. Remember how birds would flock to the carcasses and happily feast on them? They couldn't have cared less about a few dead rats. They'd have to find them first. But here was a huge deer carcass just lying out in the open. In other words, the deer carcasses weren't bait for the rats, they were bait for the scavengers. The ecosystem had become so disrupted that people literally had to manage who ate whom. To save one group of animals, they had to feed another. Wait a second, where did the deer come from? Who was shooting them? And doesn't that create a whole new environmental problem? As it turns out, the deer on the archipelago are a problem too. I mean, there weren't any deer there at all. They were introduced in the 19th century, and over time their population exploded. They grazed down the native vegetation, destroyed the undergrowth, and trampled the fragile burrows of seabirds. Those poor birds, they just can't catch a break. The rats eat their eggs and chicks, while the deer destroy the places where the birds could nest. That's why hunting these deer isn't just allowed there, it's actively encouraged, to help bring their numbers down. So the project managed to solve 2 problems at once. They removed some of the invasive deer, then used the carcasses to keep scavengers away from the poisoned rats. Okay, now that's some next-level scheming. But simply getting rid of the rats wasn't enough. If the islands had been cleared but the birds still hadn't returned, then the effort wasn't over. The islands had to be made livable for seabirds again. And this wasn't only important for nature. For the Haida, ancient murrelets are part of their cultural heritage. They're even referred to as a cultural resource. Long ago, these birds were abundant on Murchison and Faraday Islands, and during the right seasons, they were one of the main foods people relied on. So after the fight against the rats came a different kind of work, luring the birds back. People placed seabird decoys, played recordings of their calls, and used mirrored boxes, anything that could create the illusion of a living colony. Seabirds are much more likely to settle in a place where it looks as though other birds have already made themselves at home, and if an island starts to look and sound like a seabird colony again, it has a chance to come back to life. In some places, the whole thing looked like one enormous movie set, and I mean that literally. People had done this kind of thing before. Imagine a rocky island not far from Puerto Rico. There's no one around, just rocks, the sea, and a loudspeaker sending seabird calls out into the emptiness. Nearby, life-size plastic terns are attached to the rocks. They're arranged in pairs facing the ocean with mirrors positioned around them to make it look as though there are even more birds. From a distance, it really does look like a living colony, even though there isn't a colony there at all. This isn't an art installation or some creepy exhibit designed for people who are terrified of birds. It's basically the perfect seabird decoy. A bird flies over the ocean, spots an island full of other birds, and thinks, "Great place, looks safe, I can land here, and maybe find a mate while it's there, start a family." Besides, seabirds matter far more than just their own survival. They carry nutrients from the ocean into island forests. They feed at sea, then fertilize the land. So when the birds return, it's not only a colony that gradually comes back to life, the entire island ecosystem around it begins to recover as well. But what happened on Haida Gwaii in the end? After all that effort, the islands weren't simply left to fend for themselves, they remained under close watch. On Haida Gwaii, researchers installed acoustic recording devices and camera traps to monitor seabirds, other wildlife, and of course invasive species. And they weren't just watching the islands that still had rats, they were also monitoring the ones where the rats had supposedly been eradicated. Well, you never know. At first, the news was good. After 2 islands were treated in 2015, the recording devices picked up an approximately 6% increase in ancient murrelet calls. That was an important sign. At the very least, the birds were beginning to return. By 2016, the Haida Nation and conservation groups were already celebrating their victory over the rats, but the celebration was short-lived. By September 2017, the cameras had spotted rats on the islands again, and these weren't the same black rats that had been wiped out. This time they were brown rats, larger and more aggressive. But how could they even get there? Well, the most obvious explanation is that they swam. Genetic analysis showed that the new rats most likely came from one of the islands that hadn't been cleared. Depending on the tides, the swim would have been about 2,600 to 2,900 feet. Rats may not look like great swimmers, but in fact, they're far more capable than they seem. There's another possibility too. One or more rats may have floated across on driftwood, and it doesn't take much to trigger a new disaster. All it takes is one pregnant female reaching an island with no predators. And the worst part is, this wasn't even the first time, because the fight against rats on Haida Gwaii began back in the 1990s. Starting in 1997, rats were successfully removed from 5 islands. More islands followed in 2003 and 2011. Another 2 were cleared in 2013, but every single time the rats came back. And it doesn't look like they're planning to stop anytime soon. It's the same story playing out all over again. People spend years, money, and enormous amounts of effort combing through these islands, laying poison, checking for signs of rats, listening for seabirds, and setting up cameras. Then a couple of especially determined swimmers show up somewhere, and the whole thing starts all over again. So rats aren't just little pests, they're an enemy that's almost impossible to get rid of for good. You owe me a like. See you later.